All right, you bunch of hicks, let's talk about this week. Look, I'm not going to put any work into saving or ruining anyone's reputation as a modern American president because they did their own work on that. You know, when you're a war criminal, you're just going to live off the things that you did and the ways that people feel about it. Jimmy Carter was laid to rest this week. And while I'm not going to do anything to try to convince you that he was a good guy or a bad guy, I do think it's worth talking about the ways that I think Jimmy Carter is a kind of measure of the level of moral abandonment that is required to be a modern American president. By most accounts, Jimmy Carter as a person is all in all like a pretty decent person. As an individual, not in any way tied to his role as president or as governor, is someone who moved his life towards the progressive Christian principles that he was committed to, primarily nonviolence and humanitarianism. Those were things that he stood on throughout his life. And yet at the same time, when you see him in the presidency, you see that he's one of the people that helped usher in the early stages of neoliberalism that was kind of led to completion by someone like Reagan. I don't like saying led to completion about neoliberalism, but that is how it went down. He was not particularly friendly to plenty of labor interests. He deregulated key industries. And he also propped up lots of right-wing interests that served kind of American imperial interests. Carter, like every president, is for sure a war criminal. And yet, I think what is interesting when people talk about Carter's legacy is that he's seen as a kind of failed president, as a weak president. He's used as the foil to Reagan. In the national myth, the national telling of the Carter presidency and of the modern American presidency, Carter is seen as a failure, and he's seen as a failure because he was made weak by his morality, by his empathy, by his compassion, by his humanism. And this was something that Reagan stepped in to save because Reagan was not held back by those things. Reagan didn't have morals that would hold him back. He didn't have morals that he was scared of losing. He didn't have morals to begin with. Where Carter's greatest flaw was his empathy, Reagan's greatest strength was his psychopathy. Where Carter failed because he refused to tie the entirety of American success to the advancement of its most powerful, Reagan succeeded because he dedicated his entire career to positioning the most wealthy and the most powerful as the vanguard of American success. No matter how imperfectly, Carter did have moral limits on how much he was willing to compromise in order to advance American imperial interests. He genuinely, I think, thought that he could just bargain with the devil. Reagan had no moral limits. He just gave his whole body, his whole career, the body of the country over to full possession by American imperial interests. And therein lies his greatness in the national popular telling of Reagan's presidency and Carter's failure. To me, I think of Carter as a kind of control sample in the experiment of the American presidency. What happens when you put a compassionate yet imperfect person in an office that tends to attract and reward psychopaths? The fact that Carter is seen as a failure of an American president should tell us something about the level of moral abandonment and moral bankruptcy that is required to execute the duties of being commander-in-chief of the American empire. Like every single American president, Carter was a war criminal. He just wasn't enough of one. Like every single American president, Carter was an ally to the wealthy. He just wasn't enough of one. Carter's failure as a president and the popular telling of his presidency is that he was never morally empty enough. That was his tragic flaw. And I think his presidency shows us the kind of floor, the minimum of moral abandonment that is required to be a president. He's a D+ president. He's passing, but he's ultimately a failure. Also this week, Mark Zuckerberg said that Facebook was going to stop fact-checking its content. It was going to quit caring so much about spreading misinformation, and it did this in anticipation of the incoming Trump presidency. Cool, dude. Look, you don't need me to tell you that that's bad, right? That's obvious. The thing that I find most interesting is the ways that Mark Zuckerberg, of anyone, should not be in a position to have to compromise or bargain with the U.S. empire. That man has accumulated more hard and soft power than just about anybody else in the world. He has nothing really substantial or significant to lose by just saying, I'm going to sit this one out. You can just regulate me. You can make my life hard or whatever. It's fine. Zuckerberg still capitulated. He's a billionaire who controls the misinformation that gets circulated every Thanksgiving table, and he still capitulated to a president who he's more powerful than. Like, I don't think this turn of events is demonstrating, the profound regulatory powers that the federal government can wield. I don't think it's that at all. Mark Zuckerberg, more than anyone, has nothing to lose. This man has accumulated God-tier amounts of power. He could hire Sam Hinkie to try to tank his way out of the amounts of power that he's accumulated, and he could not spend his way out of it, and he could not divest his way out of the amount of power and wealth that he's accumulated. Mark Zuckerberg is out here capitulating and tucking his tail between between his legs over the cherry on the cherry on the cherry on top of the billionaire sundae. To me, that shows the level of distortion that wealth creates on a person's spirit. It's corrupted his desires and his backbone. He's lost his backbone over things that don't matter because he's got a white knuckle that little bit of control and that little bit of wealth and that little bit of shareholder value. Even the wealthy have to be sycophants for their own wealth. Look, this is not a paid-for stump, but it is a stump because this thing's good. Liz Pelly put out a book called Moon Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. His book explores the mostly negative effects that tech companies like Spotify have had on the music industry and on musicians as a whole. And look, there's so much more to get into, but I need to say this right now. Musicians, we got to start calling ourselves workers. We have to. I've often said that I think musicians are one of the canaries in the labor coal mines. If you pay attention to the experiences of musicians, you can find out a lot about working conditions. You can find out a lot about compensation. You can find out a lot about kind of just where the kind of culture of things is. I think one of the songs that Canary's singing out there in that musical coal mine is about the ways that there's not even sufficient agreement in culture and amongst musicians themselves that what we do is work at all. It's kind of honestly harder to convince you that musicians are workers than it is to convince you that musicians aren't. That's wild to me. We're sending emails, we're doing customer service work, we're managing bands and stuff, we're practicing, we're developing lifelong expertises, we're doing tech work, all this, and yet we're not workers. It's going to be awfully hard to start conversations about improving the music industry if we're not willing to call ourselves workers. That seems like a pretty fundamental building block here. Let's just get some consensus built on that. Lastly, rest in pie, Anita Bryant. I hope that the afterlife is a giant drag show and the only difference between heaven and hell is your ability to accept how goddamn fun it is. All right, y'all. Go be good to each other. Love you.